Imagine a world where the sky itself feels like it's pressing down on the earth, where the sun vanishes for weeks, sometimes even months, and the day is nothing more than a brief twilight. A place where snow blankets everything in a deathly silence, and the cold isn't just uncomfortable, it's a sentence. This was the north of Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Scandinavian winters spared no one. Sudden blizzards could bury entire villages. The winds from the North Sea swept across the land like invisible blades. And when night fell, often as early as mid-afternoon, it felt like it would never end. Temperatures could plunge below -20 degrees Celsius. Lakes froze solid, rivers stopped flowing, and crops vanished under thick layers of ice. During the harshest months, anything alive had to fight for every inch of warmth, every minute of survival. But perhaps the most surprising thing is that, contrary to what many believe, the Vikings weren't immune to the cold. They weren't ice gods or steel-hearted barbarians. They were human beings, just like you and me, facing Europe's most brutal climate with what they had: wood, stone, fur, and intelligence. There was no electricity, no heaters, no double-glazed windows. And yet, they didn't just survive. They thrived. They raised children, performed rituals, told stories, and kept their communities united, even when nature seemed determined to tear them apart. So how is it possible? How did these northern people turn such a hostile environment into a home? The answer begins with the way they built their houses. Because to survive a Viking winter, the first step was making it through the night. Crossing the threshold of a longhouse, the first sensation is abrupt change. Outside, it's all ice and darkness. Inside, the air hums with warmth and life. Longhouses were far more than simple shelters. They were thermal machines, carefully engineered to turn deadly cold into livable comfort. Picture a solid wooden rectangle, 20 to 30 meters long, aligned with the wind so that icy gusts would glide over the roof instead of forcing their way through the cracks. The outer walls, stacked logs sealed with moss and covered in blocks of damp turf, form a natural sandwich of insulation. In winter, the moss would freeze, sealing every gap even tighter. Inside, smooth wooden planks blocked drafts and reflected heat back into the room. The roof, low and sloped, was topped with a thick layer of turf. Under snow, this living blanket became an extra barrier, like a quilt made of earth. The result? Even when the outside temperature plunged, inside the longhouse it could stay above freezing, just enough to keep water or blood from turning to ice. At the center of the room, in a shallow stone pit, burned the heart of the home, the fire. Fed day and night, it served many roles. It heated, lit, dried clothes, cooked food, and kept dark spirits at bay. Smoke rose through a long opening in the roof's ridge. It may seem rudimentary, but it was a feat of engineering. Warm air escaped slowly, while the upward draft pulled in only the air closest to the ground, already slightly warmed. This meant minimal heat loss. Life unfolded around the fire. Thick wooden benches doubled as beds at night. Reindeer and sheep pelts provided padding and, more importantly, trapped body heat. And it wasn't just humans who benefited from the shelter. Cows, goats, and even chickens shared the same roof, separated by low partitions. It might sound chaotic, but the body heat of the animals was a precious resource, raising the internal temperature by a few crucial degrees. The interior layout struck a delicate balance between community and necessity. At the eastern end stood a sacred space, a small altar with tiny figures of Thor, Odin, or Freya, reminding everyone that survival was also an act of devotion. On the opposite side, near the entrance, was the firewood, stacked dry and always ready. Each piece was counted. Without discipline, a greedy fire could consume the whole season's supply. And even here, the wind tried to intrude. That's why the door was low and double-layered. Anyone entering had to bow, a gesture of respect, but also a way to stop the icy blast from sweeping through the room. Animal skin rugs hung behind the door like heavy curtains, sealing it tight. Still, even this architectural brilliance had its limits. Heat could be retained, but any exposed patch of skin still bled into the cold. To face nighttime patrols, hunting trips, or even the simple task of gathering snow, which, once melted, served as water, they needed a second line of defense, made not of wood, but of wool, leather, and fur. No wooden wall was strong enough to keep the cold out forever. Sooner or later, everyone had to go outside to fetch water, to hunt, to patrol, to gather firewood. And when they did, they carried with them the silent armor of survival, their clothing. But don't think fashion, think engineering. Viking clothing was a direct response to the brutal environment they lived in, and every layer served a specific purpose. It started with the base, a long tunic made of thick linen or fine wool, worn close to the body. This first layer was like the inner skin of an animal, lightweight but essential for trapping heat. Over it came woolen trousers, wrapped tightly at the ankles with fabric bands to keep snow from slipping in. Above that, another tunic, now thicker, usually made from felted wool or hand-spun wool, known for its thermal density. The shoulders were covered with heavy furs, from wolf, fox, bear, or deer. Not just for warmth, but also for status. Among Vikings, what you wore said a lot about who you were and how many winters you'd survived. Hands were protected by leather gloves, often lined with wool or dry moss. The boots, a crucial piece, were made of leather treated with animal fat to resist moisture. Inside, they were stuffed with dry hay, wool, or fur, depending on the region. And over everything came the hood, a kind of cowl sewn into a cloak, wrapping around the neck and head, where the body loses heat most rapidly. The secret wasn't just dressing warmly. It was dressing in layers. Each one trapped a portion of the body's heat, and together, they created a portable microclimate that allowed the Viking to face snowstorms, freezing fog, and nights where even the ice seemed to shiver. But there's another often overlooked detail. Who made these clothes? Viking women, so often left out of the tales of conquest and battle, were the true guardians of survival. They spun the wool, sewed the garments, prepared the furs, and tailored each piece with near surgical precision. Looms were among the most important tools inside a longhouse. Without them, no expedition, no hunt, not even a walk to the woodshed would have been possible. And their care extended beyond the garments themselves. Vikings used natural greases to waterproof fabrics, beeswax to seal seams, and even heated stones in their pockets or pressed close to their bodies to preserve warmth in the first moments outside. Clothing was a shield. It was a portable shelter, and often it was the only barrier between life and death. But dressing well only solved part of the problem. To stay alive through endless nights, the body also needed fuel. Not just food, but raw energy, fat, and calories. Because in the cold, even hunger hurts more. In a Viking winter, food was far more than comfort. It was essential fuel for survival. With freezing temperatures and nights that felt endless, the body needed a constant source of energy to stay warm and active. But hunting or gathering wasn't easy when the ground was buried under meters of snow and the sea was partially frozen. That's why the Vikings developed a series of techniques to ensure a food supply even during the hardest times. The Viking diet was rich in fat and protein, exactly what the body needed to generate heat. Fatty fish like herring and salmon were caught during the summer and preserved for winter use. Salting and smoking were vital methods for keeping meat and fish edible for months, preventing spoilage. Game meats, elk, deer, even wolves, were dried in the cold wind or smoked inside the longhouses. They also consumed cheese and other dairy products, often fermented to extend their shelf life. Sheep and goat milk was turned into sour yogurt, a valuable source of nutrients during the frozen season. In addition, grains like barley and oats were harvested in summer and stored in insulated barns. With these, they made thick porridge, a food that warmed the body from the inside out. Hearty soups, made with roots, onions, and meat, were a staple of daily meals. But preserving this food required planning and discipline. Every piece of salted meat was carefully packed into sealed barrels, protected from moisture and pests. Roots were buried in caves, or underground pits to keep them fresh. During the coldest months, going out to hunt took both courage and strategy. Hunting trips were organized in groups, relying on knowledge of the trails and the animals. Tracking an elk through snow was exhausting and dangerous, but the reward was worth every risk, a major food source for the entire community. Food was also a ritual, starting the fire, seasoning the meat, sharing portions around the hearth. All of it reinforced the bonds among Vikings. In the midst of cold and darkness, the act of sharing food became a symbol of hope and resilience. Still, even with so much preparation, winter remained a threat. Hunger struck some communities, and the lack of nutrients weakened bodies. That's why keeping the fire burning and clothes tightly secured was just as crucial as having food. Because, in the end, surviving the harshest nights required a delicate balance of warmth, protection, and energy. And of course, none of it would work without the most vital element, fire. At the heart of every longhouse burned a flame, small but powerful. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was life. During the long nights of a Nordic winter, when the sun could disappear for up to 20 hours, that spark was the thin line between existence and extinction. Keeping the fire alive through those endless nights was both an art and a science. The right wood, dry, sturdy, and plentiful, was carefully stored to last the season. Thick logs and smaller branches were combined to strike the perfect balance. A strong, steady flame that wouldn't burn through everything too quickly. Beyond warmth, fire brought light to a darkness that seemed to swallow everything outside. Stone lamps filled with fish oil or animal fat cast a flickering yellow glow, sending dancing shadows across the wooden walls. That faint light was essential. It drove away not just fear, but the beasts that prowled in the night. Fire was also an emotional anchor. In a world where darkness could push the mind toward madness, sitting around the flames meant more than warming the body. It meant warming the spirit. Stories and legends were told. Songs were sung, sagas of gods and heroes who faced trials equal to or greater than their own. The smoke, though thick, wasn't entirely a nuisance. The design of the longhouses allowed it to escape through the roof without choking the people inside. The scent of burning wood mingled with the smell of cooking food, creating a feeling of home and safety. But fire was fragile. A snowstorm could block access to firewood. Moisture could smother the flames. That's why the fire was watched constantly. Families took turns, ensuring there was always fuel, and someone awake to guard it. This vigilance wasn't just practical, it held deep meaning. To the Vikings, fire was a gift from the gods, a direct link to the warmth of Muspelheim, the realm of fire in Norse mythology. Protecting the flame meant protecting life, community, and hope. And so, around the fire, the resistance against winter took shape and strength. But the heat of the flame alone wasn't enough. It took human warmth, the warmth of unity, of solidarity, of shared faith. Surviving the harshest nights of the Nordic winter wasn't just about shelter, clothing, or fire. Above all, it was a battle of the mind, a challenge that demanded ancestral wisdom, communal unity, and unshakable mental resilience. The Vikings understood that when cold and darkness swallowed the world, the greatest enemy could be despair. The feeling of isolation, the fear of the void, and the uncertainty of tomorrow pressed down on the spirit like icy winds whipping through the trees. That's why community was the true refuge against the frozen loneliness. Families, clans, neighbors, they all shared the same cramped space and the same fate. Living together meant deep connection. Everyone depended on one another to survive, and that dependence forged strong social bonds. Gatherings around the fire, discussions about the hunt, debates over clan decisions, or simply the sharing of stories. These were daily rituals. These stories, filled with myths, legends, and lived experiences, created a shared sense of identity and purpose. They were emotional fuel, warming the soul more deeply than any fur or tunic. Faith and spirituality also played a vital role. The Vikings believed that the gods watched over and protected their communities. Thor, with his thunderous hammer, brought strength. Odin, with his wisdom, gave guidance. Freya, with her fertility, ensured life would go on. Seasonal rituals, prayers, and offerings kept that connection alive. Even in hardship, hope was nurtured like an invisible flame, ready to reignite courage at any moment. Mental survival also depended on constant adaptation. The Vikings learned from every winter, where they failed, where they succeeded. That knowledge was passed from generation to generation, becoming a living library of strategies and practical wisdom. They understood that resilience wasn't just about enduring, it was about turning suffering into strength and pain into insight. In this way, the mind was prepared to face not only the outer cold, but the inner frost of fear. With a union of wisdom, solidarity, and faith, the Vikings achieved a true victory over the night, the power to keep going even when all seemed lost. But of course, none of that strength would matter if winter found a scattered people, without shelter and without a plan. Surviving inside the safety of the longhouse was essential, but the true test for any Viking came when they had to face the winter outside. Whether to hunt, explore, or defend their land, the days, and especially the nights, out in the frozen landscape demanded strict strategy and almost inhuman courage. Before stepping out, a Viking would prepare both body and mind, checking every detail. They dressed in multiple layers, covering every exposed part with fur and leather. Essential tools were carefully packed: sharp knives, harpoons, ropes, and even small fire-starting kits, flint stones to rekindle lost flames. But beyond the gear, it was folk wisdom that guided each step. They knew every tree, every stone, every path, because the frozen landscape could easily become a deadly trap for anyone who got lost. Hunting trips were done in groups. As collective strength increased, both success and safety against predators like wolves and starving bears. They moved in complete silence, using shadows and terrain to approach prey unnoticed. Portable fire was a crucial invention. Small torches made of resin or cloth soaked in fat offered brief moments of heat and light during breaks. And if the night grew too cruel, improvised shelters made of branches and animal skins were quickly assembled to shield the body from cutting winds. These strategies went beyond mere physical survival. They were exercises in discipline and focus. A single mistake, one moment of distraction, could mean the end, death by cold, starvation, or an unexpected attack. That's why Viking courage wasn't reckless, but calculated. They knew when to retreat, when to advance, and more importantly, how to use silence and patience as weapons. Though dangerous, these expeditions ensured the clan had what it needed to endure the winter: meat, hides, firewood. And every return was a reason to celebrate, because it marked another step toward collective survival. But to truly overcome the winter, it wasn't enough to survive out there. You had to make it back, to the warmth of the home, to the fire, to the community. After months of darkness, cold, and hardship, dawn finally breaks on the horizon. The endless nights begin to give way to the timid light of the sun, slowly returning to the Nordic sky. For the Vikings, this change wasn't just climatic, it was deeply symbolic. It marked the end of the trial, the moment when a united and resilient community celebrated survival. Winter had been harsh, but victory was there, in the warmth of home, in the embrace of family, in the food still left over, and in the fire that kept burning. The first flowers, the thawing waters, and the less biting air announced spring. It was time to plan new harvests, prepare boats for voyages, and be reborn with nature. But this renewal was only possible thanks to the discipline, courage, and ingenuity the Vikings showed through the brutal nights. Every story told, every layer of clothing worn, every piece of firewood saved, every fire kept alive, all were part of a complex system of survival. More than that, this eternal cycle taught a valuable lesson. Winter may be merciless, but life is meant to endure, adapt, and grow. Hope is not a fragile spark. It is a flame fed by our actions, our unity, and our faith. So, as the sun shines again over fjords and forests, the Vikings move forward, ready to face whatever comes, knowing that together they can withstand even the coldest, darkest nights. Because surviving is not just existing, it's winning, rebirth, and keeping the flame of life burning bright. If you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories. And tell me in the comments, which of these strategies surprised you the most? See you next time.